Welcome back, everyone. Today we speak with Jayant Narayan. He is the policy lead for artificial intelligence and machine learning at the World Economic Forum. Now, in his role, he works with both private companies, private sector, industrial experts, industry organizations, and governments, national governments and state governments, to ensure that the technology and its impact is governed properly so it's equitable for everybody. We talked about AI governance. We talked about the state of how different countries are approaching this powerful technology. We talked about the disparity and the inequality that's being created around the world with access to technology. We talked about the future. We talked about China. We talked also about responsible and ethical AI principles and, of course, regulations by different governments. It was a fascinating conversation, and Jayant is awesome. I encourage you to take a listen. Jayant, welcome to Stories in AI. How you doing, man?
I'm good. Hi, Ganesh. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to join this. And also, if I may, a future hello to the listeners who will be listening to this eventually.
That is awesome. No, and a big, we're all, I'm sure every one of them will be excited to hear from you on this topic. And no, I would, before we dive right into question and answers and stuff, how did you get into AI and how did you get into the World Economic Forum? I'm really curious on it because engineer by education, wrote, programmed and wrote code and stuff, and all of a sudden you're directing policy decisions for countries and the world, right? Tell us your little background. How did you get into this?
Sure. And just a minor clarification, I'm just assisting and aiding, not definitely directing any decision. But sure, outside of me saying all roads lead to AI, eventually. I'll be very honest, if you had asked me 10 years ago, Jayant, would you be working in artificial intelligence? And my answer would have been, like, what? Sorry, no. Yeah, I've heard of AI. Or you want me to work in a Steven Spielberg movie? So not really. I was an engineer for sure. And artificial intelligence happened, my interest in technology policy developed in the past 5 years. I've always had a background in technology. As you said, I started off as an engineer. But I also come from a family. My dad is a retired Indian government official. So not to say that all our dinner table conversations were about policy, but some of them were. So I was always interested in the field of policy. I always wanted a little more action on the ground. So after years of coding, I reached a point where I was like, I enjoy this, but I don't want to spend all of my time sitting behind a computer screen just writing code away, outside of whatever conversations I would have with the clients, of course. And I was like, why not explore the field of policy? And when I was doing that, there was also a point, interestingly, when I almost became a journalist. I enjoy writing about policy as well. But then I was like, if it's better probably for me to work in the field of policy and shape it in some ways rather than just write about it. So I made the transition, taking baby steps. I started volunteering in an NGO. I got exposure to education policy. Had always been interested in the field of environmental policy. So I got my break in India in the field of environmental policy. And that was my shift to the world of policy, working on India's emerging law back then on electronic waste recycling. And how do you take care of that in a complex, large country like India? And that was basically the starting of my journey where I was like, okay, I think I'm going to dive deeper into technology. And even in my master's program, I did a lot of courses related to ICT, tech for good, some form of digital governance as well. Although I have to say, this is how rapidly technology changes. Just 5 years ago, the topics that we were discussing and studying were quite limited from that perspective. Now every government is talking about policy, governance, regulation of technologies, which just 5 years ago they were, but not at this level. And then I got into the forum because they have a Global Leadership Fellows program. So after my policy school, I applied to them, where every year they select 20 to 25 young professionals from around the world. We all have our full-time jobs in the forum, but we also come together in the form of a cohort and go through extensive training on leadership, organizational behavior and psychology, leading teams, etc., etc. And through that, I got to experience various facets of the forum. I worked initially in the manufacturing team. I was leading our work on technology and innovation there. So again, a definite thread of technology always being there, but also marrying it already with industrial policy. And from there, I joined the forum's new and emerging area, which we can also talk about a little bit later, which we call the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, headquartered in San Francisco. And we now have almost over 13 centers across the world that we have established in partnership with governments. I was initially in a horizontal role, working on the strategy side of things and the operationalization of these centers. So already getting exposure to what is a government's thinking when it comes to the strategy for their new technologies and also the governance of it. And while doing that, I realized that every country wants to work on artificial intelligence. And it featured predominantly other technologies do as well, because when we speak of technologies, it's anyway in combination. But it featured so prominently that I decided to dive back into a vertical role. And that's why I joined the artificial intelligence team, and I'm now working on various facets of it, including the adoption of the technology, the policy side, the governance, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my slightly long intro, but that's my story and how I got into the forum and this topic.
No, it's a very, it's an amazing story for multiple reasons. One is, as technologists, like which I am, you always think about like, hey, what can technology do for, humanity? And you're constantly innovating with technology. But the little understood fact, or the little emphasized fact early in the life cycle of any powerful technology, is how does it really impact everybody, right? And how do you democratize the impact, democratize the benefit of that powerful technology for everybody than just the chosen few, right? And so policy is a very critical conversation for that. So that's one. And then to your point, we live in a world where it's not just technology and ever since the Industrial Revolution, heck, the Gutenberg press, we have always accelerated innovation and has displaced people in the society. There's been rewiring the society, social norms and stuff. But the big difference now is the rate of change at which this technology transition is happening, right? Which causes larger periods of displacement of jobs, larger periods of discomfort for one part of the society. There's so many different facets of this, and I want to really dive into all of that with you. So you mentioned the forum. I'm a huge fan of the World Economic Forum. I know a bunch of the young global leaders are very good friends of mine, so I understand the work, the impact, the emphasis from the forum's leadership on doing that. So you mentioned the term Fourth Industrial Revolution. What is it? I mean, I know the V Forum is very, they have popularized the term, even though it's been said in many different contexts. So what is the Fourth Industrial Revolution? What was the first 1, 2, and 3? Give us the background and what's driving the impact today.
Definitely. And well, the history is when we started with the first revolution, you were like using steam power and basic mechanization. And the second revolution is when you started doing mass production. Third is when we already had the robotics side come in, electronics come in for the automation. So there's also a bit of debate out there where people are like, are we still living in an extended form of the third industrial revolution? And the forum does not agree, and which I also don't agree, because the velocity, the scope, and the system's impact that we're experiencing now, and you mentioned this, Ganesh, the speed at which it is all happening is something that we have not seen before. And the boundaries between the physical sphere, the digital sphere, the biological sphere, all of them are blurring. And the combinatorial aspects of technology that we are seeing is something unprecedented. So the gap was always there. And this is also in terms of a few actors developing the technology, some lead people adopting it, but that gap is also widening. So there are also huge societal implications when it comes to the fourth industrial revolution. One technological development could create a huge ripple effect, which impacts not just a specific industry, but also associated industries. And we saw that, like the classic example, Uber coming in as a mass transit option. Like when I say mass transit in the sense that not car ownership will go down. That has so many changes for a car company. If you ask a car company 20 years ago, were they thinking about it? Probably no. And now that 20-year timeline is even further reduced. These changes are starting to happen in like a matter of 2 or 3 years, or sometimes even less. So yeah, that's how we think of the fourth industrial revolution.
And then it's beyond just as you said, the car industry, the insurance industry. How does it, impact the mass transit that is already in place to, optionality, passive income. There are so many different threads or layers at which the impact happens, and it's powerful. So, what characterizes a fourth industrial revolution? Is it the rate of change and the scope of impact, or is it technologies, or is it a combination of both?
It's a combination. It's the technologies which are driving that rate of change and how quickly they are adopting, and outside of the classic Moore's law, and how quickly our computing capacity has also increased. It's now just accelerating at a speed that sometimes even companies and the developers themselves, and that happens in the field of artificial intelligence as well. People are like, my model has become too complex for myself, and we are losing control of it. So it's a combination of both, like the developments that we have seen on this front and some breakthroughs. I can take the example of what Google's DeepMind did. The protein folding problem, never solved for 50 years, and now they've managed to crack it. And that's it. Look at the rollout of the COVID vaccines. Would you have ever imagined a full-scale vaccine being rolled out within a year of a global pandemic? Not me. It takes years of trials. So all that shows that technology is now just accelerating at a pace where both positive and negative impacts come in, and that's why it's important for all stakeholders to also balance.
It's interesting, you touched upon a few things: stakeholders, impact, early adopters, early, technology leaders, developers. Like that same, mRNA vaccine development or protein folding problem. I mean, there's a common thread. It's large, powerful organizations that have the technology supremacy to actually do it. Definitely the impact is going down to everybody, which is great. It's a classic example of how this can be so powerful. But on the other hand, you take the Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica example, which was another thing where you have centralization of information and knowledge residual on human psychology and the ability to influence large groups of people to do whatever a central party wants to do, right? So AI is a powerful technology, and my question to you on that is, how do you see the effects of that distributed across the world? Give us a view from your vantage point, where you see across the world, right? How are countries doing? How are organizations? What size of organization? What kind of organization? What sectors? Give us a worldview of AI and the impact of AI.
Sure. And I think, Ganesh, you pointed out something super important. Are there early adopters? Are there certain people who are taking the lead on this? Well, adoption is one side of it. The other side of, especially if we speak of artificial intelligence, a big part of it is also the development. And over there, we are seeing that it is quite skewed, that the power, if I may use the word, on the development side is restricted to some major tech actors or some major countries that are taking the lead on it. Be it the US, be it the China. I don't have to name all the big tech firms, because it's also as much a function of how much capacity and resources you have. And by that, I mean everything: the human resourcing, all the best brains of the world, but also the computing capacity, the infrastructure capacity. So we are seeing a trend where there is definitely a few actors who have that almost dominance in that field when it comes to the technology side, and quite a few countries and companies are lagging behind. Like if we again take the example of countries, around, I would say, less than 40 countries have rolled out a national AI strategy, which means that there are almost 150 plus countries which still don't have a national AI strategy. So they don't even know what is the first step that they should be taking. When it comes to companies, we are seeing that most of the companies still, more than 70% of the companies, when they launch something, and multiple surveys exist in this field, including some of the work that we have done, when they launch a pilot, be it in AI, be it in smart sensors and multiple other use cases, they just get stuck. They never scale up. And some of these problems are there in AI, but some of these problems also exist beyond AI, where AI is one of the use cases, but the technological adoption as well. So from a larger vantage point, we are seeing that there is definitely an increased recognition. That part cuts across. No matter where you are in the journey, everyone knows we have to do something about it. The second important step is who's already started doing something about it. How are they being smart and strategic about it? It's also much more of a business decision as well. Like something as simple as a company saying, should I develop this in-house or go out and acquire? There are already lots of enterprise AI solutions out there. So does it make sense for me to start something from scratch? And it has ramifications for that. However, our work has shown that some of the laggard industries, as we call them, like the slow moving ones, or the heavy industries, have also now started looking into it because they recognize that importance. The good thing over there is that they have years and years of historical data. So they do recognize it. Of course, we can get into the details of what goes beyond technology and why some of these use cases don't scale up. But yeah, so that's the larger vantage point. Quickly on the governance side of technology, I'll just take a quick 30 seconds on that. This is where I think it's a function of how a particular region thinks about it. So if you look at the governance side from the EU's perspective, they always use the word, this is grounded in our European values of democracy and human rights. So when you take that sort of a lens to both the technology development, its application, as well as governance, it's a different sort of a setup of framework. And that also could be very different from a country, which is like, no, all that is good, but right now our focus is just on the application. We want to scale up the technology, and we'll talk about principles and human rights and ethics later. So it's a myriad sort of, it's a mix of things that we are seeing here. And I would say there's still very much of a gap.
Got it. No, and we'll come to the ethics conversation in just a little bit. But one thing I always wondered, and just to break it down for everybody, for organizations, companies, and private institutions, it's the case for AI is very evident, right? You are able to now process more data to reach more customers, grow your business, or you can actually use automation AI to reduce costs. So it affects your balance sheet, affects your income statement. The why is very, very clear, right? It's shareholder value, right? You mentioned national AI strategy. Why should countries have a national AI strategy? Why is it important? You probably touched upon that early on because it affects things, but why should you really have an AI strategy at the national level?
And the answer, that's a great question. The answer to that is the systems view that you need in the fourth industrial revolution. So it's not just about developing a strategy for a specific technological application. This is very multi-pronged. If you're developing a national AI strategy for a country, it has everything to do from the infrastructure to the talent development to technology development or acquisition. Like what kind of a country are you? Do you already have technological prowess? Are you lagging behind in that? What's traditionally been your R&D in? Not every country would have the kind of money, let's say, that the US has. It's projected they recently cleared almost 200 or 250 billion in tech R&D, and a big chunk of that will go to artificial intelligence. So it's hard to compete with that. And that's why countries need to take stock of the situation. What can you realistically do? What can you realistically not do? Where can you play a leading role? Where can you learn from others? But without that, the gap will just keep on increasing, because once you develop this will already give you a lot of data points on where you stand as a country when it comes to the realistic development, adoption, and dissemination of
and
AI.
The reason, so again, back to the why the governments have to think about it, is because of the asymmetric disruption or benefits it's going to have on the society, on governance, right? And it's not just AI, right? I mean, things like decentralization and cryptography, the impact it's having. El Salvador just made Bitcoin their official tender last week, right? So it's but their idea of when you try to combine that with values, and we'll come to values in just a bit. Well, the idea of democracy in El Salvador is very different than the idea of democracy in the United States or Europe. But is that why they're actually is it the asymmetric disruption it may happen on the society, the destabilization of existing systems?
All of that, and also the important element: are you a net importer or are you a net exporter of the technology? Who's setting those rules? So if you're a country which is, let's say, 99% importer of AI technologies, nothing is being developed in-house. Let's just hypothetically take the scenario. The rules are being set by someone else. This means the product will come into your market. This means you have no strategy, you have no governance framework for it. Someone has already set the rules, someone has already set the standards for these applications. So it's also taking stock of all that. And the dependence, so the asymmetry, yes. The impact on citizens, yes, which, as you also pointed out, the definition of that can vary across countries, but also the larger strategic issues.
Interesting.
Beyond
No,
that.
that's good. Thanks for breaking that down. On the concepts of policy, let's stick on this AI or national policy, if you will. What are the tenets of a good policy? How do you think about it? You touched a little bit on it. Take stock of what you have. I love the way you said it, which is that take stock of the net import versus export requirements. Kind of like how would you? And this is the digital trade of this was what you would do when you were doing manufacturing, but you just look at it from a digital perspective right now, right? So, what are the tenets of a good policy that a nation should
Right.
have?
The the tenets of a good policy, from my perspective, again, if you start at the topmost level of, I like how you brought this trade example, and it is a bit like that. Like, you must understand where you stand currently. There are lots of documents and research work now. Like, Stanford also has an AI policy index, and if you look at some of these national level AI indexes out there, some of the buckets remain the same. It is the talent that you have in the country. It is the tech ecosystem that you have. It is IP protection. Some of the things that you would see in traditional tech development as well. What's changing again here is these, coming back to the point of how skewed it is. And there are pockets and hubs already. There's a very fascinating piece of research which the Chicago's Paulson Institute did, which shows where does the top AI talent end up, which already gives you a glimpse of where the market is. So if I'm a country, I have to make sure this is about the being realistic part. If all the top AI talent is going to the US, or most of it, there's a reason for it. So it's also that this is the ground reality where I'm starting from as a country. And if this is my ground reality, where do I go from here? So you would still be realistic and you would say, all right, I'm not going to compete on the highest level of applications because I'm too far behind. What I can do is I can be smart about it. I look at my internal ecosystem, and let's say if I have a relatively or moderately strong IT ecosystem, I can still incentivize the development of AI solutions. I can incentivize startups. What I'm not trying to become is like a big tech company which is providing the GPU accelerators, which is providing the cloud infrastructure. So a good tenet would take all these things into mind. And also, you can be ambitious. This shouldn't stop you. If you're saying, all right, in the short term, I can't do this, but in the medium to long term, I am going to have a robust R&D ecosystem. I am going to be a net developer of this technology. These are the steps that I have to take in order to do that. And then you will have to touch on all sorts of parameters. This would be, as I was mentioning earlier, infrastructure, talent, the governance in place for these technologies, and building from foundational level. You're not starting from scratch. You already would have some sort of a digital or tech ecosystem. So also look into that, because that does impact. It's not a completely, of course, data science and AI scientists. It is a specific niche expertise, but you're starting from somewhere when it
Let's
comes to
talk ethics and AI and ethics. Probably the hottest topic in AI right now, right? If it's not NLP and computer vision and transformer models, now it's all about ethics, right? So, you mentioned this, like the European policy was about how do you reflect the European values in AI. Isn't there an inherent problem in this where there is no set of values that the world over that we all believe in? I mean, very few values. I mean, you can argue that, human life is important as being one of the core set of values, but you can really argue with certain countries now they're treating human beings, right? So how do we solve that problem? Is there a G20 or a G100 for AI, or should there be? How do you solve the values problem?
It's a very interesting question, and you're the second person who's asked me this question. There's also a researcher from Brookings who asked me the exact same question. I would say we don't need a separate body on it. My realistic assessment is that it will be hard to come to get to some sort of a consensus where 20 or 25 countries agree, or 30 countries. Maybe 20 will agree, but as you start expanding, the definition, the taxonomy, how do you even define human rights, how do you even define values, could start varying across countries. So my answer to this is always start at the common elements. There's always going to be differences across countries. What are the common elements? And you mentioned one of them, Ganesh, human life. And we are already seeing, like, when it comes to responsible AI or ethical AI in the field of medical devices, every country, irrespective of how you think about human rights and values, still wants to protect its citizens. So if you're already using some sort of a medical device which has an underlying AI ML solution, or you're thinking about it in the next 5 years, you do want to protect the life of your citizens.
Yep.
So there, I'm just taking that as one of the examples. So finding the common elements is important. And the same also goes, and there are use cases where ethics of AI is not critical, I would say. Like if you're using AI for flood forecasting, my ML algorithm does not have to have a modal compass,
Sure.
arguably. So it's also getting that sort of a consensus. I think there are enough policy bodies and instruments out there. Countries are already starting to think about it. Like this was one of the first things that happened when Europe came out with its regulation. People started drawing some comparisons with the US's FTC guidelines, the Federal Trade Commission. And they also have some similar language, like on the European high-risk use case side. The FTC also says that any sort of algorithm which is discriminating or on the credit scoring side will be regulated and governed. So there are some commonalities, and that's what I would say should be the starting point. Coming to a consensus on a complete set of 10 values that every country would agree with, it's going to be hard.
So, Jayant, no conversation on AI and government's responses to AI is complete without a conversation about China,
Of course.
right? They are the behemoths of this thing. They've risen into AI power as an AI superpower over the last, decade or so. I did go through their AI development plan, the 2030 plan, and briefly here and there in excerpts and stuff. And while there was a lot of focus on how do you develop AI, how do you invest in research, how do you actually build capability within, there was very few mention or very little mention about the ethical considerations that we were talking about, right? What's your comments on that?
It's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people ask. So firstly, yes, when you look at China or even some of the countries like India, the primary lens is a bit of, yes, I want to become a leader in AI. And it's similar to, you can draw an analogy with energy policy. When you started back in the day, you wanted to lift people out of energy poverty. And of course, now China is one of the leading developers in renewable energy as well. That said, China does have principles on the ethical side of AI as well. I think the important bit here to consider is what's the lens that they are taking. I would like to believe that even the Chinese government, when it comes to protecting its own citizens, would very much be concerned about the ethical side of AI as well, especially if there are a lot of AI products out there in the market which Chinese consumers are partaking in. So it's important to consider that in point. And when we talk about China, a lot of people also talk about the international cooperation side. Like, is this a race and China is leading ahead, or is it the US? I think there are elements where people can also collaborate and cooperate with China. It does happen to some extent. One of that would be the application of AI and ML in the field of, let's say, environment, or a common public good. So things like healthcare, things like energy, things like environment, you might find more commonality. Of course, there are some contentious topics always where one country's system or value system might vary very differently from the other. So always trying to find a common ground on that can be challenging.
There's already some, to your point, there's some cooperation or even monetization of that happens within China. So the Chinese government and the entities there collect a lot of data about their citizens, right? Which is a very useful asset for any training of machine learning models anywhere in the world. Right now, it may not be the exact same characteristics of the audience or the data that you have, but then that's where techniques like transfer learning and stuff come in, where you can actually transfer the knowledge residual within that data to another machine learning model in a different country. And I know of some companies who are doing this for healthcare, right? It's really hard to build healthcare systems in the US because getting hold of the data is hard. So you can get this obfuscated, privacy preserved data sets from another country, similar to different behavior, right? And then you can use some unique ML techniques to go put that out. So let's talk a little bit more about the society and the transition that we're going through, automation and AI, right? So AI and automation we know it's going to displace a lot of the parts of the society. It's going to eliminate a lot of jobs as we know it because of automation, right? We already are expecting that. But it also will create new ones, right? How do you see, how do we prepare as a society for that transition, as individuals, as members of the society?
Excellent question. Again, often spoken about, no matter which stakeholder you're connecting to. And this is something that Ganesh, you and me had discussed previously, which was also, are you going to work for the machines, or are you going to make the machines work for you? I think over here it's important for any major stakeholder, be it like a country building out a strategy, or be it a company which is building out its horizon on AI talent, for example, is to develop that short-term, medium-term, and long-term view, and being realistic about the goals. Just to take as an example, if you're a country which is currently slightly lacking in STEM education and the number of scientists and the number of data scientists you have, it will take some time before you can produce a good quality data scientists. The benchmark is really high out there in the world. Some of the data scientists have been thorough academicians for 10 years. I know it's not every person goes through that rigorous academic training, but just to say that it takes quite some time, takes quite a few resources. So it's for countries to take that short-term, medium-term, and long-term view. The long-term view will be about developing that rich ecosystem and local talent, which can take time. The short and the medium-term view could also cater to some of the immediate demands. For example, if sticking to the same example from a country, you might not have the best data scientist talent in-house, but with more and more AI systems coming in, you do need peripheral support jobs as well. In addition to, of course, the high quality, like I'm a cloud engineer, I'm a AI and ML engineer. In addition to that, and also with the regulatory system shaping up, like so much talk on regulation, so much talk on AI certification, conformity assessment. So there'll be a role for that as well. So keeping that horizon, keeping an eye out on how the AI and ML space is growing in your country or region is important, and build out the strategy accordingly. I always take the example of Taiwan, which is very small, relatively speaking, compared to some of the larger regions and countries out there, but they have an excellent STEM education system. And as a result of that, they are one of the largest chip manufacturers in the world. So drawing an equivalence with that is something that countries should definitely consider when talking about developing that talent.
I agree. And I think it's interesting, you see, there's two parts of it, right? There's the government and the governing systems and the ecosystem that'll provide and lay out opportunities and paths for you to help with the transition. But even as individuals, there are things that you could do to smoothen that out, to be prepared for that particular thing, right? If 15, 20 years ago, somebody asked me like, hey, do you want to be a digital marketer? I'm like, what the hell is that, right? I mean, marketing was just advertising or, strategic marketing when you're launching a product, right? Peter Drucker way. Yeah. It was never really envisaged that the whole internet is going to create a whole explosion of channels and digital channels, which will now have to be used for marketing, right? So
right.
In any transition, these kind of new jobs will evolve. And one of the things that I've heard, and I always tell people, is to look at characteristics that an AI system can, of the human race, that AI systems cannot easily emulate. Storytelling, the ability to actually think, have the empathy in the way you actually connect with people, communication. So a lot of that elements are still very innately human. And, that will be one path to actually really invest in future, which Definitely. Kind of is very counterintuitive, because STEM education is not necessarily, art and, linguistics and other things, right? So that's why STEAM is now getting more steam, if you unintended.
STEAM is getting more steam indeed. No, I completely agree with you. That's something for individuals and countries too. It's always a healthy balance as well. You don't want a world just full of engineers, else we'll be in the matrix.
Yeah, I agree. So what in AI, and we kind of probably talked about it, but what in AI do you want everybody in the universe who's in AI to be working on right now?
Well, it really depends on who you are in that space and where you are in your journey. If you are someone who's completely lagging behind, you'll have to start with the very basics. things, some of the things that you might have heard in your initial days of a digital transformation journey somehow precedes now when you speak to companies, everyone is talking about AI transformation. So depending on the stakeholder you're speaking to, if you're far behind, you need to break down those data silos. You need to build interoperable platforms because that's what's going to fuel any sort of a AI ML system that you build out there, especially if you're talking about a cross enterprise level. And if you're a more advanced, let's say, company or country, you still have to keep exploring the new frontiers. And there is a lot of fascinating work happening out there. I'm sure everyone here follows OpenAI, GPT-3, some of the interesting work, as you were saying, Ganesh, happening on transfer learning, especially this element of transferring some of the innate human empathy culture into a machine, especially as we build a long-term view in some of the more aging societies like Japan. So keeping an eye out for the trends and developments in that space is important. And yeah, it's just figure out where you're in your journey. No one can afford to be complacent, no matter whether you're in the early stages or you're much more advanced. And I don't see it as a milestone. So you'll have to continue exploring the turf and working on it.
Awesome. So I got some rapid fire questions for you, Jayant. AGI, just a quick transition from where we are right now, right? Artificial general intelligence. Do you believe it's going to happen? Is it going to happen in our lifetime? Do you worry about it? What specifically do you worry about?
If I were to ask, I mean, sure, if theoretically, conceptually, do I worry about it? Yes, because it does put in your head the sort of image that's been put there by movies. But from a realistic perspective, if I put it, I personally, and from whatever work I've seen in the space, I don't see it happening immediately. And when I say immediately, in the next 20, 30, 40 years. And again, there's no absolutism to it.
Sure.
Sticking to that Hollywood example, if you're talking of the ultra machines out there, we might reach levels in the next 30, 40 years where there'll be rapid developments, which are components of AI. But in my lifetime, at least, I don't see like a superhuman machine, which is incomparable from a human.
Sure. 100 years from now, give me a story how we will be interacting with AI in 100 years.
Maybe we'll be living through the Matrix then. Just a slightly more positive scenario where the choice between the blue or red pill does not go down a very dark route. So a more positive scenario, but almost living together with machines, but humans staying.
Sorry, do you really mean that we will realize in 100 years that we are already living in the Matrix?
That's something that I might wake up to tomorrow. So who knows?
Could be very possible. And my last question to you, what question do you have for me?
What question do I have for you? Sticking to that point of a positive scenario, in the next 30 years, give me an example of a very positive scenario which has been enabled by an AI system. Choose any industry, choose anything.
Sure. I mean, I'll choose the sovereign individual, right? There is definitely a huge movement that we're seeing with massive decentralization happening. The trust in these centralized systems are getting eroded a little bit. And, there'll be strengthening exercises from governments, parties, institutions, and individuals going to happen. But what it really is turning out to be the sovereign individual becomes all the more powerful. So in about 25 to 30 years, I am pretty sure it's going to happen, and I hope it happens, and I want to make it happen. You will be, as an individual, you will have a lot of freedom of choice in a variety of different things, including your employment. So instead of actually having to, build a company, hire 100 people to do things, you can hire 100 robots, or intelligent systems that'll do the work for you. So it's a classic example, and where we all want this to go, right? The perfect marriage of humanities and machines, artificial intelligence and human beings, where the humans are in charge. You still have your wills and desires and aspirations, and it's being executed through intelligent and automated systems for your benefit. That's a scenario I see happening in the next 25 to 30 years. And parts of that is already happening, right? Like you turn around, you humanize Siri right now. You talk to, my son before he goes to bed, talks to Alexa for like 30 minutes asking questions about all the things he wanted to learn about that day and he heard about, right? So it's a different brave new world out there, but in a positive way. I think that is a scenario I see most likely happen, because one of the reasons we're doing this, this conversation on this effort on stories in AI, is to bring more and more diversity of thoughts and intent into this conversation, right? And inspire action.
Right.
So everybody is going towards the same goal of really getting into a world where humans and machines coexist, with humans really still making the calls.
Excellent. I hope that positive scenario plays out for everyone's benefit.
It will. Now, Jayant, thank you so much. This was such a blast, such a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming.
Likewise.
And
And thank you for having me.
all right, thank you for jumping on.